Thursday, October 4th, 2018, and I'm in the home of Steve Ashkinazy in Brooklyn for the second part of an oral history interview for the Stonewall Oral History Project. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It's really great. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the early days of the GAA. I interviewed Hal Weiner recently. He was a lawyer.
Yes, he was a lawyer. He did, and he was an ally. He never, at least then, never identified as being gay. But he was an important fixture and did all of our legal work for free.
So he tells this great story about how he met
Wow,
the
how
GAA.
old is he now? Good, because,
He's in his early 80s.
okay.
So he was a new young lawyer.
He seemed old to me at the time, but
He's not gay. He didn't know anything about gay issues. He had no opinion one way or the other, and was in court. One of the things he did was help prostitutes get out of jail, and he happened upon Sylvia Rivera and a group of GAA early members, and saw that she didn't have any representation, and
that was it. That was a wonderful story.
So I'm wondering, were you involved at all in the things like incorporating the GAA and its early, sort of establishing an early structure?
No. I came into GAA in October of 1970. They were newly in the Firehouse. They already had a president and a structure. I sort of described in the last interview how I came to, because I was told about the dances and discovered that this was a wonderful community network, not just a social network, but a community. And I can talk about some of the things that I was involved with there.
So we did talk about that. So
Yes.
And I listened. It's actually, I think,
Right. I talked about my work on two committees, and it was interesting because I was never really inclined toward some of the political analysis and strategy that was going on. Although I became involved in it, especially after I became lovers with Todd, and he just insisted that I had to be. So I was always involved in that, but I would consider myself a peripheral figure in those. I would go to those meetings, I had an opinion, I would do what people told me, but much of it went over my head. I just didn't really care as much as I did about the interpersonal reactions of people within the community. And so I took on those two committees that were sort of put upon me as, you should do this, and I did everything that I had to do. I'd love to tell a story, which I was just reminded of. I think you said that you had watched, I think, the eulogy that I gave for Todd, and I told about a very early project at GAA, which was the Johnny Appleseed project, which was an amazing project. And Todd and Morty Manford spent, I think it was 6 months, going cross country in a different city every week. Are we recording well?
Yeah, keep going.
Good. They went to a different city every week, and in the course of that week, they set up, they taught the community how to set up a gay organization. It was very successful. So in early 1971 or mid, but it was in 1971. My family was planning a vacation. We were going to Las Vegas, which was something we were doing in those days once a year or twice a year. And so when Lou heard that I was going to Las Vegas, he said, we never got to Las Vegas. So they said, you have to do the Johnny Appleseed project in Las Vegas. I was 22 years old. I said, no, 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 I can't. You know, this is too hard. And they said, no, 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 we're going to tell you what to do, and you're going to do it. And as I said, I just never knew how to say no. So in 1972, while I was vacationing with my family and some other families who were friends of our family in Las Vegas, I had to set up an organization in Las Vegas. So this is how it happened. First thing that you have to do is I had to find out where there was a gay bar. And there was no literature, and there was no internet, there was no way. So the way to find out where a gay bar was I had to find someone gay. So how do you find someone gay? So in the hotel, desk clerks are usually gay. It's you know, men who work concierge desk clerks. It's a very gay profession. So I watched the front desk until my gaydar went off, and I was sure that this was a gay person. And I went over and asked him where there were gay bars. And he gave me an earful. He said, he was very happy that I asked him. And he told me that, interestingly enough, in Las Vegas, where gambling was legal and prostitution was legal, homosexuality was not legal, and gay bars were not legal. He said, there is a gay bar. It's exactly 3 miles out of the city limit, which it had to be. So it's, the only way to get there was driving or by taxi. But there were no gay bars within the city limits of Las Vegas. So I planned a trip, and I got a car service, and I went to this. It was right out of a movie. It was really a roadhouse. It was in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing. It was in the desert, along the road, a 1-story wooden ranch house type structure with a big split rail fence around the parking lot. Looked like a corral, a ranch. And I went to this gay bar. And following the playbook, I spoke to the bartender, told him that I was from New York, from the Gay Activist Alliance, and he was very, very interested. And I said, and this was like on a Wednesday night, and I said, would it be possible, you know, what I'd really like to do is come back on, I don't remember, it was Friday night or Saturday night, one of the weekend nights, and speak to people here about how to set up a meeting. And he said, absolutely. And I said, and what I ask you to do, and everybody here now to do, is to tell all your friends that we're going to be doing this, and what we have to accomplish on that night is picking officers, passing, and I brought all the literature about what the bylaws should be, and so there was a woman in the bar came up to me and said, you're staying at Caesar's Palace, right? I said, how do you know? She said, I work there. I was impressed that she recognized me, and it turned out that her job at Caesar's Palace, she worked for the photography program there, and she would wear this long gown, and she would go and photograph people at their tables while they were eating dinner, and then by the time dinner was finished, she'd come over with the photograph that you could buy. And that was something that, I don't know if nobody would do that anymore. But that was a typical thing that happened in fancy restaurants and resorts, that they would take your picture. And she said because she worked in photography, she said that she has very good facial recognition. This is what she did. She would take pictures and then bring them back to you. So she knew who I was. What I was most surprised at, though, was all of the lesbians that I knew in New York in the very early 70s were very short hair, no makeup, denim and t-shirts or blue chambray shirts. It was a uniform. She was glamorous. She wore a gown. She was heavily made up, as in the early 70s, with like double rows of eyelashes and hair piled up on her head and very fancy. That was a Las Vegas lesbian in the early 70s. And so over the course of the next few days, she kept saying, I have to introduce you to other people. I have to introduce you. And so we spent the next couple of days at Caesar's Palace. She was dragging me around and introducing to me people, including many showgirls. And so it was not just, and her name was Michelle. And she was from Long Island, but she ended up in Las Vegas. So I was only out to my parents for about a year. And here I was running around, every time they saw me, I was running around the hotel with showgirls, like following me and whispering to me. And these women, again, heavily made up, boobs coming out of the top of their, whatever they were wearing, and hair piled up in extravagant hairdos. And I was, hanging around with them and running around as we were conspiring to whatever we were, trying to do and plan. And my parents were totally confused. And their friends were totally impressed that, I knew all these people, was hanging out with them. Anyway, we Saturday night we met, and it went like clockwork. I was so afraid that this was over my head that I couldn't do this, but it happened by itself. I just had to turn the switch. People immediately said, "Oh, so and so has to be the president, or so and so has to be involved," and everybody did everything. I handed out the literature, told them the guidelines, but it was something that needed to be done, was waiting to be done, and I became the catalyst, and it was thoroughly exciting. So in that early Johnny Appleseed project, I had this one. I started the ball rolling in Las Vegas. So there's one other part of that story that's very funny. People also said, oh, you have to talk to, his name was Betancourt, who was what we call a city councilman in Las Vegas, at least then was an ombudsman. So there was a closeted, but known to the gay community, ombudsman. His last name is Betancourt. People said you have to talk to him. So I was brought to his house, and this scenario just sounds straight out of the prologue to a porn film. So we went to this big house, and we were let in by a young man and just wearing a Speedo and nothing else. And there were several young men in Speedos in the house. There was a pool boy, there was a cook, there was someone cleaning, and it was all these young, beautiful men wearing very, very little. And then I was introduced to Mr. Betancourt, who was, I would say, mid to late 30s or early 40s. And we started talking, and he said, first things first. And he took me to his bedroom, and we had sex. As I described in our last interview, I have no problem with sex. And back then especially, I was extremely sexually active, and he wasn't a bad-looking man. He was certainly within my range of taste, so I didn't object. But it did strike me as ridiculous and inappropriate, and and he didn't ask but he said first things first. We went, we had sex, and then after sex we went back into the living room and we talked, and I described what was being done at GAA in New York, and our work with the media and with legislators, and how we're trying to change things. And he listened intently, and he said, this is a great idea, except for one thing. He said, it should be done secretly. He says, there's no reason to be out. He said that he loved the idea of organizing the community, but he thought that the idea of letting the outside world know was a terrible idea. So that was, but otherwise everything went very well. And as I said, there were a lot of people who were extremely excited about the idea of moving this forward. And I don't know what became of the project. Part of the scenario of the Johnny Appleseed project was to give the people in each city contact information in New York of the leaders at GAA if they had questions or needed help with things. But I wasn't that contact person, so I don't know what happened to it. But I did have that wonderful experience of that, that week in Las Vegas setting up the gay organization.
So I have a couple of questions. That
Yeah.
is a great story.
Mm-hmm.
One is, do you remember where you had that first meeting, and how did you explain to your parents that you were busy, given that it was a family vacation?
I don't understand the first part. The first meeting.
So the Saturday night when you
Right.
you go to the bar and you say to people,
Right.
why don't you, with my help, start this group?
Right.
Where did the group get its start? Like, literally, did you go back to the bar, or where was that first meeting?
So the first part of that was on a Wednesday night, asking the bartender to speak and just telling everybody that was in the bar on that Wednesday night what we were going to do, and inviting them back for Saturday night and tell them, bring your friends, bring other people. If you know people who you think would be interested in this, tell them to please be here. And I gave out some literature, some leaflets. There was a book. Are you familiar with what was a booklet called 25 Questions About Homosexuality, written by Ron Gold?
Well, is that what people think of as the kind of GAA handbook?
Probably, yes. I think so. Ron Gold, who, as of a year ago, was still alive. I saw him in a wheelchair during the Gay Pride Parade. I saw him on the sidelines, and I went over and spoke to him. He was very thrilled to be recognized. Not a name you're familiar with?
I
Ron
am
Gold.
not, but that
Okay.
doesn't...
Yeah.
That,
Ron Gold.
okay.
He wrote what you're calling the GA Handbook, which was a book called 25 Questions About Homosexuality, which, when I read it fairly recently, not very recently, but it's a bit strident, but it was a really good antidote to everything that was written before, which was so negative. So, so the role was to give this information out and to tell people to come back, and my role at that point was to tell people, you have to set up this organization. One of the requirements, and this was a very important principle at the Gay Activists Alliance, was this is a one-issue organization, which meant we didn't take on housing, we didn't take on welfare, we didn't take on racial discrimination, but this was about promoting LGBT rights. So that was one thing that we told them, that that's what this organization has to be. And you need a structure, you need officers, you need to, so that Saturday night meeting was to just get the ball rolling, to tell people, but they did vote on officers that night. So, which gave a structure and assignments, and people did take on the responsibility and the task of saying, okay, this is your job now.
And do you remember sort of how you felt about yourself? Like, was it a confidence booster that you accomplished that?
Very much. But I was also terrified, every step of the way, I mean, as smoothly as everything went, it didn't really convince me that the next thing I had to do would go as well. But every step from, as I said, from speaking to the the hotel clerk who didn't just tell me where the bar was, but told me all about the laws and people could not have been more helpful. And the fact that the women, all of the, lesbians that I met in Vegas were so culturally different than everyone I knew in New York, was entertaining and just, I enjoyed that very much.
And did your parents know that you were?
No, they did. They saw me running around with these, but I don't remember really discussing it. But as a family vacation, Las Vegas is different than going to Costa Rica. So we didn't spend a lot of time as a family. We ate meals together, but my family would be my parents would be at the gambling tables. We did go to shows, but I had lots and lots of free time, which I had no interest in gambling. I had no interest in slot machines or blackjack. So I had lots and lots of free time.
So then I have a question about Betancourt and him saying "stay secret." What did you think of that?
I don't think I laughed in his face, but I thought it was really funny, and just realized that he doesn't get it. And I don't know, in retrospect, maybe more than at the time, I don't know. Just realized, well, he's invested in his public image, and so it shouldn't have been surprising. But I realized that he wasn't going to be a useful participant in this project.
So some of the people I've interviewed talk about that era and its great difficulties and the fear of losing your job and rejection from family, of course. But they also talk with a little bit of nostalgia about being a group that if you were in it, that it was different to be inside than out. And I'm wondering, does that resonate for you? Does that make any sense to you?
100%. I tell people this frequently, that when people talk, when I talk to younger people today, and they say, "Oh, it must have been so terrible," and yes, it was. I mean, I knew people who were arrested. I knew people who lost jobs. I knew terrible things that happened to people. But it was so exciting, being an insider, having the secret. You literally were a member of a secret society, and going back to college in the 60s, I had gay friends, and we were part of a larger circle of friends, but within that larger circle of friends, we knew each other, and we had secrets that we didn't share with the other people. So there was a great deal of excitement. Plus the bathhouses and the bars and the tea rooms, which I spoke about. Have you found anything else about that? Looked into that?
I have a little bit, but as you were saying, not very much.
Yeah, it was a major part of New York culture, and there was a similar culture in London, but they called them cottages instead of tea rooms. So when I went to England or met people who came here, other than that one word translation, it was the same culture. In London it was cottages, and in New York it was tea rooms. But so talking about how much was at stake for some people, I don't know if I talked about this in that portion that I didn't listen to, but did I talk about one of the things that GA tried to do when we were trying to become better known and reach out and do fundraising? Did I talk about the fundraiser that we had around the book Society and the Healthy Homosexual by George Weinberg? So
I think so, and people came and they,
right.
They would write checks and
That's
still
right.
they
Okay.
said,
So people were just too, people were too afraid to be outed, and so nobody would write a check. So that was a great disappointment. Another, we were trying to reach out to celebrities. So one person that we reached out to, because he was the playwright Arthur Lawrence, who wrote West Side Story and Gypsy, wrote the movies The Way We Were and The Turning Point. His partner of many years, Tom Hatcher, became a friend of mine, and actually was also having a little side affair with Bruce Voller, who was the president of GAA. But Tom Hatcher and Arthur Lawrence were together for like 40 years, ultimately. So we met with Arthur Lawrence and tried to convince him to come out. And I mean, later on he did, and directed the Broadway musical La Cage aux Folles. But at that time, his reasoning for not coming out is as astounding as it is. He said, "I cannot come out publicly while my mother is still alive."
And this was the
She
early
lived in
70s?
Florida. This was the early 70s. His mother lived in Florida. He says, "I cannot come out while my mother is still alive." And after she died, he did.
So I want to ask you a little bit more about the GAA. I don't think we talked much about the fire and the
I'm glad you
consequences
brought it,
of
yeah.
the fire. So
Okay.
can you tell me the
Yes.
story of the fire?
Yes. First of all, in listening to the tape, I realized that whenever the recording, I realized that every time I reference that, I described it as when the firehouse burned down. The firehouse did not burn down. There was a fire. There was a lot of fire damage. But the building didn't burn down. Everything was intact. It was covered with soot, but it was unusable, and we lost that space. I do believe that it was an inside job. In fact, someone confessed to me once that he did it, and I don't remember his name. I know what he looked like. Remember who he was. And it was over internal politics, and after a new regime came in. And so before I can talk about the consequences, I have to say that why was there a firehouse to begin with, and one of the big differences in New York City in the early 70s and New York City today, or even in the late 80s, is that all of this space was available. And the LGBT community, and especially the gay men's community, benefited tremendously from societal and urban changes like the collapse of the shipping industry and the collapse of the factory and industrial neighborhoods of Brooklyn, of Manhattan. So certainly the Far West Village and later on Chelsea, you had all of these factory spaces and warehouse spaces that are sitting unused and available for pennies. And so, yes, this, the Gay Activist Alliance, which was this, radical organization with very little money, could afford this huge building in what now is Soho. You also had bars and backroom bars that were palaces compared to these tiny little claustrophobic places that gay people congregate in today. They're fancier today, but they were enormous and roomy back then. So so it was a different city, and it was also very helpful for the gay community, the fact that we had these neighborhoods that nobody was in. So the Far West Village and Far West Chelsea along West Street, you had bars that people who were closeted weren't afraid to walk into and out of, because you weren't afraid of being seen going in and out of them. And sex would pour out onto the streets. And you had places like the Trucks and the Piers which were playgrounds, sex playgrounds. But they were in neighborhoods that were easily accessible to residential neighborhoods and where people were living, but they were enough off the beaten track that very closeted people could feel very safe exploring their identity. So
and that was true of Soho also.
that was true of Soho, which is why the Firehouse was there. My first restaurant was there. I lived in Soho for 35 years. I had an apartment on Prince Street, just off the corner of West Broadway, for 35 years, paying pennies for it.
So after the fire happened,
Yeah.
what happened to the
Okay.
GAA?
Okay. So that was a big blow. We didn't have our space, and I still have more things I want to talk about what happened in that space when we had it. But we had an organization, and we needed a space. So arrangements were made with a bathhouse called Man's Country, which was on 15th Street, just off of 6th Avenue, just east of 6th Avenue, which is one of several, men's bathhouses in the city. And so the owners of that property agreed that once a week we could meet on whatever floor, 5th floor. So it was unlike some other bath. It was a very strange building because it was kind of narrow and long, and it was very horizontal. So vertical. So there was I think there were 11 floors of this bathhouse, and each floor had a different character and persona to it, and that was part of the charm of Man's Country. And so for the additional year or less that GAA continued to exist, it met in this space that wasn't really theirs and wasn't really convenient, wasn't really accessible. I think it wasn't terribly comfortable for women, and so that certainly led to the demise of GAA. That was where we met. I had mentioned that the gay employment project, which I was operating with Mel Rosen, we tried meeting there for a few weeks and realized that wasn't going to work, and that's when we moved to the office space at Mattachine Society and ran it for another year there.
I see. So, because I read that the GAA moved to Mattachine, but it was really the employment project.
Yes, that was the only part of GAA was the employment project. But GAA continued to meet to strategize and political issues. So let me talk a bit about some of the ends of GAA. So let me talk about the origins of the National Gay Task Force, which was an offshoot of GAA.
So we did talk about that.
Okay.
We talked about Bruce Voller.
Okay, I did.
GAA
Okay, so that's
president, and how he liked to make his own decisions, and that didn't
Good.
fly.
So we talked about that. Good.
And that you were the only person who stayed with both.
That I know of. I think I am.
Yeah.
And in fact, I recently, when I talk about papers, so the after Bruce Voller, was president, left with a whole contingent of, other leaders and officers and committee chairs, we needed a new president. And that became Morty Manford. Morty asked me to make the nominating speech because I guess I was seen as a whatever, transitioner or crossover person. So I made the nominating speech for Morty's candidacy for president. And that's one of the papers that I found recently, my handwritten speech nominating Morty Manford for president. So I guess that's definitely historical.
So the other thing I read, though, is that the GAA, technically at least, still existed into maybe 1980 or 81. Was it really?
Did?
Yeah, I mean, that's
So,
somewhere
okay.
I read. But really it ended more like 75, would you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like saying I've heard that, Gay Liberation Front also existed for many years after, like, but I don't know what they did or.
Yeah. Maybe it was
So.
just not, the incorporated part was just not sort of registered
Okay.
as no longer.
It comes as a surprise to me to hear that GA existed that long but.
Well, I
It could
haven't
be.
met anybody who has memories beyond the mid-70s. I
Oh, okay.
think maybe just technically.
Because I think that the other thing is that because the National Gay Task Force existed and did have a space and had a whole different operating policy, it took the wind out of the sails. I guess people didn't feel that there was a need for GAA, although there really was, because what was wonderful about GAA is that on a weekly basis, everyone could show up and everybody could have a voice. And no matter what was discussed, you could raise your hand and you could get up and speak about it. And everything that was done and decided was decided by a vote of everyone present. National Gay Task Force did not have membership meetings. Everything was done behind closed doors. It was a small inner circle of people who made the decisions or even knew what was going on.
And there weren't dances and there weren't street actions.
Right, there were no street actions. One of the things that there was, and I know I spoke about this in the last, I was asked to participate in that project to challenge the city and the state about the treatment of LGBT kids in the foster care system. And that was great. That was such an education for me to be brought into that. And again, one of those accidental things that happened to me that steered me in the direction that my life took of working with LGBT youth.
So, but before we talk about that,
Yes.
because
Yes.
we did talk about
Please.
that a little bit, I
Right.
wanted to ask you about Lou, Todd, and the Ballroom.
Yes. Did we talk about the ballroom at all? Or?
We didn't.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm wondering, does it make sense to talk about Lou first and your relationship with him?
Sure. So if you saw my eulogy to Lou Todd, so this love at first sight. It was a Scarlett O'Hara, Rhett Butler moment. I was coming down the stairs from the third floor, in my cocky way because I was, very at home at the Firehouse, and saw this figure talking to some people and looking at the bulletin board, and was very attracted to him, and he looked at me and
When
totally
was
changed
that, more or less?
it. 71, early, yeah, spring. I would say spring of 71.
And he was maybe 20 years older than you, or?
He was born in 1930, so he's 29 years older than, 19 years older than me, yes. But he lied about his age. For, I think I say this in the eulogy, I always said he was 10 years older than me, and it wasn't until he retired at 65 that he got outed that he wasn't 55.
I forgot that.
And looking back on it, though, it's incredible and astounding to me that I didn't see through that, because he didn't look. He always looked older than he was, but he was a character, and he was a big macho truck driver guy. There's a story I like to tell. This happened in this was from the 80s, but there was a backroom bar, a new backroom bar opened called the Anvil, and they had these sex shows on stage on certain evenings, and they weren't just sex shows, but they were like wild, great, kinky sex shows that had to be seen to be believed. And I knew the manager there. I attended Broad once there when they were so busy. They asked me to help out, and I told Lou, "You have to see this. You have to see. You can't believe the things that they're doing on stage." So I brought Lou one night, and we're sitting in the show supposed to start at 11, and it doesn't. It's like 40 minutes later. I go up to the manager and I said, "Is there going to be a show tonight?" He says, "Yes, but I think there's a undercover police officer in the room, so we're being cautious, we're waiting." So when I told Lou, and we waited, another half hour goes by, and I get curious, and I go back to the manager and I said, "Where's the, which is the police officer?" Yes, sir. And he points to Lou. So Lou had that effect on people. So, but, okay, so I described earlier that it was Lou who brought me into all of the political strategy meetings and all, and made me be part of that and participate, even though it wasn't where my natural inclinations were. So Lou, prior to Stonewall, Lou owned his own Mr. Softy ice cream truck. And after getting involved in GAA and knowing that that's what he wanted to do full time, he sold the truck and retired. And he was able to do that for a couple of years. But eventually that wasn't realistic, and he had to go back to work. And he decided that he would open an ice cream parlor. And he also felt that he wanted to do it right around the corner from the Firehouse, so that people, it would be a dessert place, ice cream and desserts. He felt that when people left the Firehouse late at night after meetings, we had to go all the way to the West Village, to Hudson Street. One of the places that we used to go to was called the One Potato, which was a bar and hang out. And so Lou thought it would be great if there could be, that he would open a place right around the corner and people from GA could go there. But he needed money to do this. So he told several friends, including myself, into investing. Now, as I said, it didn't take a lot of money to do things then the way it does today. And now I was just at the point, I had just decided that I was going to go back to school to get my MSW. And so up until then, the work I was doing was in the theater. But I was very idealistic in the theater, and I was doing a lot of off Broadway. I was working at Cafe La Mama and Cafe Chino and all of these great, East Village experimental theater companies. And they didn't pay well, but it was very exciting, and I loved the work that I was doing. And I did other things too, better known, and I won't go into my career, but I had a good career going. But when I decided that I wanted to go back to school and realized I need to support myself for a while and pay for school and I won't be able to work, I took a couple of jobs that were high paying but low prestige, industrial shows and all that paid way too much for very little artistic merit. And just saved up some money to support myself for the next couple of years going to school. Lou came along and said, instead of living off your money, why don't you invest it in my ice cream parlor, and then you'll have an income. So I was very naive. I didn't know that, at least at that time I know, 2% of new restaurants in New York ever make a profit. So, but I gave over my money for a share in the company, not realizing that I'd end up having to work there too. Originally, so the Ballroom, and this is very interesting. Lou got 10 people to invest in the bar, including Bruce Voller, including Alan Roscoff, including Tom Hatcher, who I mentioned, who was the partner of Arthur Lawrence. 10 of us became Lou's partner in the Ballroom, which is a totally unworkable, business venture. And so Lou would work there during the days, and a different one of us, we'd alternate, would work at night. And we did this for a year. And we're deeply in the hole. Couldn't pay bills. We were going to go out of business. Lou, Todd, and another one of the partners, Greg Dawson. Does that name ring a bell?
No.
Okay. Greg Dawson was also one of a very, very important early, he deserves a whole chapter on his own. Greg Dawson was an important part of GAA, and also one of the founders and at the National Gay Task Force. He also, prior to this, in the 60s, Greg Dawson worked as an assistant to Robert Moses. You know who Robert Moses was?
Absolutely.
Okay, he was like his director of public relations or something like that. So he was. So Greg Dawson, Lou Todd, and me, at their urging, decided that no, we wanted to still make the Ballroom work. And but it needed further investing. So this was proposed to everyone. So of the 10 of us, 7 said, no, this, I'm burnt enough, I don't want to be part of this. So we restructured the corporation all, and 7 people dropped out, and Lou, Greg, and I became the 3 partners of the Ballroom.
So I have a question. So if I'm right, you opened in '73, is that right?
Yes.
So by the time you were restructuring, the fire would have happened, is that right?
Yes. Right.
And so that's, there's so many things about that are interesting, because we were talking about how Soho was kind of empty at the time.
Yes.
So maybe you can keep going and tell me how you turned the Ballroom into a place that was, I don't know.
Well, first of all, because there were 10 of us, which was 10 different ideas, Lou's original idea of opening ice cream parlor dessert place got blown out because everybody had different. So by the time we opened, we were a French continental restaurant with, you know, very fancy food. I also designed the place as a set designer. I designed and built the place. You know, I spent, you know, a couple of months just physically doing all the work, converting this factory space. It was a plumbing supply store to a fancy restaurant. So, so our first year, we ran a really nice place and had a great reputation, but we didn't. It was a bad business model. There were lots of problems with it, but the place was lovely, and people who did come there loved it, and but it wasn't viable as a business. And it's okay. It's just but the place was very nice. So when we restructured, actually, this is really important history too. So 2 things. We decided we needed a liquor license. I'll stick with that. Back in 1975, this is, I guess, about 4 or 5, it was against the rules of the New York State Liquor Authority. Known homosexuals could not own a liquor license. And because we were gay activists, it wasn't acceptable to us to just slide under the radar. We needed to make an issue of this. So in applications for liquor licenses, part of the process is that you have to show why you're an upstanding, respectable citizen who could be trusted with a liquor license. And so our application was all full of all of the important community work we were doing as gay activists. I don't remember who it was that told me, but it was actually a relative of mine has a friend who used to play cards regularly with someone on the State Liquor Authority. And he told me that this was a huge discussion. They weren't even sure that we were for real, but they thought that they were being set up, that this was going to be a test case. I don't know, we weren't that far ahead thinking. We just wanted to do this. And so it got through without, so we were the first, Lou, Greg, and I were the first people to successfully challenge the State Liquor Authority's anti-gay ban.
Cool.
So it was cool, yeah. So we got our liquor license. The other thing that was a big change, we decided that there should be music. So first we started introducing incidental music, just people playing in the background. And that went over really well, we liked that. And then we decided that we wanted to actually be a cabaret. And offer a nightly show with dinner. And so we decided we needed to find some wonderful unknown talent. And in the first couple of years of our ballroom as a cabaret, that's mostly what we did, was present unknown talent and help them get discovered. And we were wildly successful beyond our imagination And
You know what? Let's just stop for a
okay,
second.
sure.
Hello, kitty. Where is the? Oh, here. He or she.
That's he. There's a she somewhere too. I can put it down. So.
Being held prisoner.
Hmm?
Okay.
So briefly, so whether it was luck or astuteness, I don't know, but we ended up discovering terrific talent that, and our place was packed. We were paid all our bills, and we're doing really well, and discovered people who went on to become stars. One of the great stories, one of the people who performed at the Ballroom, and actually was our house pianist for a while, and he did like once a month. He had a Monday night to play his own material. Was Alan Menken, who went on to write Little Shop of Horrors, Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast. Tremendously successful, but he was our house pianist in like '76. So so we did really well and became known as like the premier cabaret. Then because Greg Dawson, as I said, he was a publicist, he sort of pushed us away from discovering new talent, and because people wanted to play the Ballroom now because it had a reputation. So we started to have people there like Peggy Lee and Eartha Kitt and Rosemary Clooney, and a lot of famous people played the Ballroom. So another thing about the Ballroom, there's a lithograph up there that's a painting. Should I tell you about that? Okay.
We talked about it, but not.
Okay.
But after the interview.
Right.
We didn't talk about
Okay.
it as part of the interview.
So we commissioned, because we were in Soho and Soho was happening. So, you know, we were in Soho because it was around the corner from the Firehouse, and the Firehouse was in Soho because it was cheap, eligible space. But in those ensuing couple of years, Soho started to gain a reputation as the art center of the world, of the new emerging art scene. And so we commissioned that mural. That's a lithograph of a mural. The original mural is 14 feet wide by 8 feet high. It's a huge mural. The artist, Marion Pinto, is the character in white, the only figure with her back facing us. Everyone else in the picture are important pioneers of the early Soho art movement, including some famous artists like Larry Rivers and Robert Indiana, and some early gallery owners. And so everyone in that figure, in that painting, sat for their portrait individually and was an important art world figure. When we unveiled that mural, the New York Times did a major piece on it, and it hung in the club for a long time. When we closed, because it was so big and didn't have any money we donated it to the Museum of the City of New York, and my name is on a plaque next to it as donated by. Unfortunately, in that year and the ensuing few years, I was not able to take advantage of the huge tax write-off that would have afforded if I had an income. Mm-hmm.
That's fabulous. I'm going to go look at it.
Okay.
That's fabulous.
Right.
So, I think.
So that became another important thing, and the connection between the Ballroom and the community. As I said numerous times, organizations operated on minimum budgets, skeleton crews, and as the owners of the Ballroom, we always made our space available to organizations for fundraising parties. And for several years, I would say that 80 to 90% of every fundraising event in the LGBT community was held at the Ballroom. And partly because we gave everything away. We didn't negotiate. We just, you bring the people, you keep the money, and we'll donate the liquor and the hors d'oeuvres.
That must have felt great.
It did feel good. It felt very good. And
And were you and Todd, Lou, still a couple at that during those years?
we were a couple for 1 year, or was it 2 years? No, let me see. 2 years. Lou and I met in 70. I think we broke up in 72. We became business partners in 73 and stayed close friends until when he died. Well, in the last few years of his life, I was his caretaker, visiting him at least a few times a week, and became the executor of his estate. So, but we broke up as partners before we became business partners.
But you had a long, deep connection.
We had a long, deep connection, and I never understood. I know most people, once they break up with someone, don't want to ever see them again, and they don't even want their friends to speak to that person. I'm exactly the opposite. I don't understand that attitude at all. Everyone, I have a lot of ex-lovers, and almost every one of them is a very close friend.
Good for you. That's lovely.
I think it is. I think it's sensible too. So.
If you like them at some point, presumably they're still likable.
Right. So it doesn't mean that breakups are not hard, but I've never had a contentious breakup. I've just had painful breakups. Sometimes painful because I was the one being dumped, and sometimes painful because I felt guilty that I was the one leaving. And in every situation, we supported each other through that breakup.
So I want to ask you about Stonewall. I was thinking, if I'm right...
Stonewall Democratic Club or Stonewall the bar? Or
Stonewall the bar,
okay.
and Stonewall
the riots.
Well, and I know that it was in no way the start of the gay rights movement, but
yes, it was.
Well, right, it's considered
absolutely
an important
was
marker. Right?
Well, it was
before, and there was
but that wasn't a movement. Management was an organization that served a purpose. It was really useful, but the Stonewall riots were the beginning of people saying, "We don't have to take this crap anymore." That was revolutionary. That was the spark, the need. So yes, it's not an exaggeration to say that the Stonewall riots started the gay movement. There was no movement before. There were some individuals who were more out than others, and who saw the gay community as a community, but the idea of protesting, of changing things, of demanding our rights, that was all a result of Stonewall.
Well, thank you. People describe it differently, but I wanted to hear how you describe it.
Okay.
So,
there were precedents, but it was like the difference between, colonial days before, the American Revolution. There was an America before there was America, with colonialism under, Great Britain. But it wasn't a revolution.
okay. So in 1979, when the 10th anniversary, was that important to you? Do you remember marking that and thinking, oh, it's been 10 years?
I remember we doing that at 20 years. What did we do? I'm trying to remember the march in 79. What was I doing in 79? A lot of things were happening in 79 was when the Hedrick Martin was founded. 79 was when I was beaten up by the police in the cruising demonstration. So I can think of a lot of, momentous things that happened in '79. I went with the gay contingent to Israel for the first time. That's gonna ring
That's
till
okay.
it's
Let's.
okay.
So I want to ask you, and you can take us in any direction, but about the LGBT Community Center and your role with the mayor, with Mayor Koch.
Yes. Okay. So one thing I have to set the record straight about the LGBT Community Center. And I've done this with other people that were, because I love giving credit where it's due and talking about people on whose shoulders I stand, and so someone who's not given nearly enough credit is Irvin Kuperberg. If you go into the lobby of the community center now, there's some big plaques to Paul Rappaport and to other people who were on the founding board, gave lots of money. But the center would not exist without Irvin Kuperberg. It was his idea. And when he first proposed the idea, many people thought it was overreaching and impossible. Irvin Kuperberg, before starting the center, he was the president for several years of CBST. And it was Irvin Kuperberg who decided early on, even before some of the things that came later, that you could raise money in the LGBT community. And he made CBST very successful. We had our own space, events, a small working staff that, most other organizations did not have. And through Irvin Kuperberg's genius and skills, he made CBST a successful community organization. And after doing that, Irving believed that he could do the same for the larger LGBT community. And it was his idea to start the LGBT Center. Again, it was on the fringe end of available cheap space, but he found that building, he found that empty high school, the old Maritime High School, and he recruited the entire first board, including myself. Just people that he knew in the community who either had money and were giving money, or were politically involved and knew other people and had connections. And so I was just returning from my year in Israel. I spent 82, 83 in Israel. I was just coming back at the end of the summer in 83. Got a call from Irving. He's starting this project, and invited me to be on the board. He recruited the entire first board. Interestingly, there was a competing center happening at the time, as you probably are not aware of. Because, as I said, many people thought that Irving was crazy to go from no community center to this huge building. What would we ever do with that much space? How would we ever be able to afford to even take care of the building, no less pay people for staff? There was someone else, and I always forget of his name. His name was either David Tenenbaum or David Shapiro. Both of those are real people, and I don't remember which was which. And he wanted to start an LGBT community center in the Federal Archive buildings on Christopher Street. It would be a small space in the basement, a few rooms, and that seemed more real. And he also asked me to be on the board. And I was torn at first, which was more realistic. But Irving convinced me that he was going to pull this off, and I agreed to be on his board. And so glad that I did. So what do I feel that my contributions to the center were? I showed up at meetings. I gave my opinions about things. I helped introduce and make connections. I'll tell you an interesting thing that I was instrumental in, and this sounds hard to believe, but it's an example of how different our culture was and different our understanding about certain issues. One of the organizations that was involved in the early days of the center and used the space there was NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association, which promoted sexual relations between adults and minors. Because of the work that I was doing with youth, I knew that not only was it wrong, but it was a dangerous situation, and I had to convince the board of the center that NAMBLA should not be part of the center. And it was an uphill campaign. People thought I was, some people on the board, especially Steve Alt and Jim Fratt, some of the more radical people, thought that was intolerant and that we were going backward and that it was anti-liberation. So I had to convince and teach the board why NAMBLA could not and should not be part of the center. Believe it or not, I had to do the same exact thing at Hedrick Martin. Believe it or not, the lawyer who incorporated Hedrick Martin, Michael Lavery, was an officer of NAMBLA. And another original board member of Hedrick Martin was Mark Rubin, who was a wonderful person. I loved him, but he felt that liberation should be for everybody, and he left the board when, at my insistence and my convincing, when the board of Hedrick Martin decided that NAMBLA could not be part of the board. Not only Michael Lavery, the lawyer, left, but in solidarity with those people, Mark Rubin left the board. But getting back to the center, yes, it was an uphill battle to convince the center board that NAMBLA should not be on the board. So, and the other big thing that I did is I was very instrumental in getting the city to sell the building to, I think I showed you a picture of that event, yes, okay. So I say that it was instrumental, but I think it was going to happen anyway. But when the center was trying to buy the building from the city, and we had just missed the envelope of opportunity by a couple of years of when the city was selling buildings to community-based organizations for $1. And we were literally just a couple of years out of that envelope of when certain, when the city was turning around and certain neighborhoods, certainly the village, were starting to become viable economic, real estate markets again. So, no, the city was not going to give us the building for $1. But would they sell it to us, and would they sell it at a bargain rate? The mayor did not want to do that, partly because our original board included people like the ones I mentioned before, Steve Alt and Jim Fratt and some others who were radical opponents of the mayor this was Mayor Koch, on every front and took every opportunity in the media and at rallies to attack the mayor. And so he wanted nothing to do with the center. I had some ties with the mayor, and certainly, had very close ties with people who were very close to the mayor. And so a meeting was set up. It was Ethan Ghetto and Norman Levine, who set up this meeting for me to meet with Ed Koch, Mayor Koch, to talk about what a good job the center was doing, and despite some of the rhetoric from radicals on our board, why the center was an important tool in bringing the community together. And we had this meeting. It was just the two of us, and I just told them about all the different groups that met at the center, the organizations, how many people were served during the course of every week by the center. And at the end of the meeting, Mayor Koch said, okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to have my people talk to your people, and we're going to come up with an arrangement, and this is going to get done. And then he said, now, do you want to have your picture taken with me? Now, I really believe in looking back over this, that this was going to be done and that this was a formality. Do I think that I convinced the mayor against, that he went into this meeting thinking that he wouldn't do this? I don't know. I tend to think that this was going to happen and it was a formality, but I did play that role and have that great opportunity to be in that position to at least symbolically move that forward.
It probably helped him to see that an activist was a reasonable, thoughtful person.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Good.
So I want to ask you, because we're almost out of time. As I know you know, in June it will be 50 years since Stonewall.
Yes, that's why I wanted to write my book, but I didn't do it.
So, what do you think from this vantage point, looking back on the last 50 years? What feelings and thoughts do you have?
Well, as you said before, anybody who thinks that everything was terrible back then is mistaken. We've gained so much, but we've lost some things too. But just as the city has, we lost the bathhouses. There was something I wanted to talk about. This is slightly off topic, but a really important historical thing from the 60s. When everything was underground, there was something in New York called the Bird Circuit. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
Okay, good. There were gay bars in New York, but there was one string of gay bars on the Upper East Side along First Avenue and Second Avenue from 59th Street up to maybe 71st Street, or just that. There were a number of bars, and they all had names. There was the Red Robin, the Pink Flamingo, the Blue Parrot. I forget all the names. There was something. I forget all the names, but all of them had names, and that was the way that you knew that it was a gay bar. That it became, if it had, and it was called the Bird Circuit. And that's what even tourists or people coming to New York, if you were gay, looking for it, you knew that those were gay bars. So that was part of, what underground New York. Another thing that was very common, and this was around the country and in a couple of European places too. Harry's Bar, and the one in New York for some reason was called Harry's Back East. But Harry's Back East were always gay bars. And if you were traveling and found a Harry's or a Harry's Back East bar, you had reasonable reason to assume it might be a gay bar and go there to check it out. So that was just part of like the underground gay community in New York. So, but you asked me a big question, what I make of all the changes. Of course it's wonderful. And the experience of coming out today is so different. We were talking before about challenges and how important it is to have challenges. I was at a conference last January where I was listening to some teenagers talk about their angst and coming out and all, and the phrase they were using, one of them, and was using this phrase, then it became everybody started using it. He just said, I just wanted to live happily ever after. I just want to live. And I finally felt right then, like on the third day of this conference, I said, if you live happily ever after at 18 years old, what is the rest of your life for? I said, the challenges that we overcome are what become the victories that we celebrate. You have to have challenges. So not that there aren't challenges today, but they're certainly different. They're certainly on a different level and stature. So what do I make of all the differences? I mean, some have nothing to do with the movement itself. The internet has certainly changed the experience of coming out. It used to be you had to steal a book from the library to find out anything about homosexuality because you couldn't check it out.
So is Stonewall and as a place, both the bar and or the area around it, is that kind of culturally important to you? Do you see that as a place like when something big happens, like
even before
marriage?
that, one of the very first journals, magazines, there was Christopher Street magazine was one of the first national magazines. So so Christopher Street, yes, it has cultural, historic importance, even though it's not what it was. And but yes, so Stonewall, I guess every community, every culture needs landmarks, and so yes, Stonewall and Christopher Street are those for our community.
And does it matter, or how much does it matter to you that they got recognized as a national monument?
I think it's nice. I went to that ceremony. Is it, how important is it? I think it's important. I'll tell you another thing that I did. And I won't try to dig it up now, but I'll send it to you. You know the Richard Siegel statues that are in Christopher Park, the gay liberation statues. So I mentioned that I was on community board for 30 years. So when those were first proposed, the community hated them. There were some important community, not LGBT community leaders, but village community leaders who called them pornographic, who called them ugly, who didn't want them. So I have an issue of the Villager newspaper talking about when those were erected, and in the article it mentions me by name as being instrumental in convincing community board to accept those statues.
Let's just pause for a second.
But in terms of play, so that was right in front. It's on Christopher Street or right in front of Stonewall. So in terms of the designation of historic space. So yeah, so I do have, proof, from this article in the newspaper, that I had a role in getting that accepted.
So before we say goodbye, is
Mhm.
there anything else you want to tell me?
I don't remember what we said, there was the cruising demonstrations, and there was, there were, someday maybe we'll talk about the Harvey Milk School, and, 'cause that was something that I feel proud that I actually almost single-handedly, that was like my project, setting that up. The work that I'm doing now in the, with Eshel and in the Orthodox community, and what's exciting, what's interesting is that on some levels what I'm doing in the Orthodox community now so closely mirrors what we were doing 40 years ago just in the general population, that breaking down very, old, solid barriers. But it can be done, and it is being done. So, I always run into people who either have no sense of history or no sense of vision, and so they think that the way it is it can't change. Say that, oh, this won't change. Won't. Say, what are you talking about? It's been changing, and it is changing.
I think with that we'll say goodbye.
Okay, yeah, those are good. Thank you. Are we on?
Yes.
Oh, good. So I was telling you, one of the strange, interesting policies that the Gay Activist Alliance had was that in order to become an actual member of GAA, you had to agree to go through an orientation meeting. An orientation meeting was just a big group, circle, therapy group. It was just a talk. And as early as 1971, I was running those orientation meetings. And looking back on it now, I'm not sure how that came to be, because I wasn't a social worker yet. I wasn't a therapist, but I guess it was both part of what led me to that, but also maybe a recognition of what my skills were, because I've talked about what some of them were, what they were not. I was not a political strategist, but I would run these orientation meetings, and so every new member that came into GAA went through my orientation meeting, and where we'd go around the room and people would ask questions and everybody would get to answer it. But one of the stories that I want to tell, one day, who should show up at one of the orientation meetings? And I spoke about how we wanted to get celebrities involved. Jerome Robbins. Do you know who that is? Jerome Robbins, important choreographer, choreographed West Side Story, Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, if you Google Jerome Robbins, is up in the league with Balanchine in terms of being one of the major dance innovators of the 20th century. So Jerome Robbins came to my orientation meeting, and we spoke, and I exchanged numbers with him because I had this great idea. I knew one other theater celebrity that I had had an affair with a few years earlier, Eric Bentley, who was a theater critic, but also the foremost translator of the works of Brecht. And so I thought, I need to set up a meeting to sit down with these two people, because they're both well-known celebrities, and talk about how we can use their celebrity and their connections to advance the work that GAA is doing. And I called them both and described this to them and never heard back from them. And in fact, they didn't answer. And it was only after that that I discovered that not only did they hate each other, they were enemies for a reason. That during the McCarthy period, Jerome Robbins was someone who was accused of being, because he had gone to communist meetings, and so to get out of the problems he would have faced, he named names, what was called names. And Eric Bentley, who was a staunch communist and socialist, he wrote articles attacking Jerome Robbins for this, as he did to other people who. So I was this innocent 22-year-old who just thought, two theater celebrities, and I'll bring them in and see how we could, and got caught up in this decades-old political fight, involving McCarthyism. So.
Tell me a little bit more about the orientations. What did people need to know, or what did they need to share to be kind of qualified, to feel trained to become a member?
Well, first, I want to say that nobody was disqualified. You had to go through this, but no one was deemed as too closeted or too negative. Part of it was to make sure that people understood the nature of the organization and how it worked, but it was also, but everyone was required to talk about things like when they knew that they were gay, who else have you ever come out to people that you know, and what was that experience like? It was just some rudimentary sort of consciousness-raising experience of discussing people's personal identities and orientation to their identity. So just having the chance to explore that.
And did that feel like a radical thing to do in a group in the early 70s?
It was, because it wasn't something that people did. People, even people who were very involved in gay life was going to bars and drinking, and it wasn't about talking in a group about experiences. In fact, one of the things that I realized very recently, I was talking about coming out, and when I told someone that I came out at 14, and they said, "Oh my goodness, what did your parents say?" And I said, "Wait, the term coming out has, I don't know if it's evolved or it just flipped, because I don't know when it happened, but it means something very different than it used to mean. Today, coming out means telling the world or telling important people that you're gay. That's not what it meant in the 70s, certainly not the 60s, because nobody did that. It was crazy. You didn't come out to your family. You didn't come out to your boss or coworkers. Coming out meant having your first experience. And everybody used that term. When people said coming out, it meant finding out where other gay people were and entering the community, usually actually having sex, but certainly going to a bar. But I think in general, most people use the term coming out as meaning having your first sexual experience. And that's what the term meant in the 60s and the 70s. In fact, I do remember that at the 1979 March on Washington, actually you asked about if things were different in 79. That's one thing that did happen. There was commemoration of 10 years after Stonewall. We had the first national LGBT March on Washington, which had its fundraiser at the Ballroom. and actually got picketed by a couple of individuals who didn't like the coordinating committee of that and thought that they were stealing money from the community, which was absolutely not true. So, but Kate Millett spoke at that march, and one of the things I should remember that she said, of all the communities, that people belong to, whether it's, people of color or the women's community, said the, lesbian and gay community is the only, is a minority, she's a minority. The lesbian and gay community is the only community that anyone can join overnight. And I think that was allusion to the fact that was what coming out. That was what people saw coming out was you do it. And that makes you gay. So
no one has told me that before. That's great.
About the
about using coming out in that way.
Yeah, it's very different. It didn't mean, people use the term coming out, and it certainly didn't mean telling other people, because that would have been stupid. Nobody did that. So a quick thing, I mentioned that there was this very, very small group that was picketing and protesting the coordinators of the National Lesbian Gay March on Washington. So one of the major coordinators, you know who Joyce Hunter is? Okay.
I do.
Okay. Very important, pioneer. Not from the very beginning, but early on, and had several major roles in the LGBT community.
So just so I'm right,
Yeah.
I think I know her through Hedrick Martin.
Yes,
right?
she worked at Hedrick Martin. And and that's part of the story. So, she was one of my colleagues at Hedrick Martin. And when I started the Harvey Milk School, the person that I wanted to be our first teacher and our only teacher was Fred Goldhaber, who was a wonderful teacher, did a terrific job. He worked for many years as the teacher at the Harvey Milk School. But what I didn't realize that Joyce had a big axe to grind with him, because his lover of several years had been the organizer of the protest against the organizer of the National March in Washington, and who actually sued them. And Fred Goldhaber signed on, to that lawsuit against them. And so in order to get Fred to be allowed to be the teacher at the Harvey Milk School, I had to make peace between Joyce Hunter and Fred Goldhaber for him to convince her that he just did this for his partner. He had nothing against her, and that his partner, R. Paul Martin, I don't know if you know who that is. He, for many years, maybe even still, he he has a program on WBAI, but he's an idiot. He just is.
So I want to ask you maybe one more question. So in the early GAA days, how much were women a part of it, and how much were men of color?
I'll tell you a story about women. Women were part of it. Although there was no sense of trying to have parity, people like Nath Rockhill, who was our vice president for a long time, but there were and Jean O'Leary, Ginny Vida, but there were contingents within the women's groups who wanted to be separatists, but they still met at the Firehouse.
And did
for a long
women
time.
come to the orientations, or were
Yes.
they? Yeah.
Yes. So I want to tell you a terrible story. Do you know who Jill Johnson is? Wrote a book called Marmalade Me. She was a journalist, and she was an early, very important icon of the radical lesbian feminist movement. And that group would meet at the Firehouse. I don't know if it was once a week or once a month. But because of the way the Firehouse was laid out, one area flowed into another area, especially. So one day, there was one, I seem to remember it as an afternoon, but maybe it was an early evening. But Jill Johnson was facilitating a group of maybe 20 women sitting in a circle. And I wasn't part of that group, but I was just in the next area, but there was no boundaries. I was getting ready for something that I was going to be doing later, and I was trying to be very quiet, but setting things up for something that was coming. And so I heard what was going on. Now, Jill Johnson had a son. I'm pretty sure his name is Richie, but I could be mixing with somebody else. Richie was 13, just 13, although he looked 16. And he used to hang around the Firehouse. And I think he was gay. He looked gay, probably was gay, but I'm not sure, and he was only 13, so it's very likely he was having sex with people there. But we were friendly, and we would talk. And I think he saw me as a mentor. And Jill Johnson was talking to these women, sitting around a circle, and Richie came in, and and Jill Johnson is kind of giving almost a speech about how women need to stop helping men, and that it's holding them back, and they need to focus on their own needs. And Richie, he kind of just sort of sauntered into the area, and he sat on the floor next to his mother's chair, and he put his head on her lap. He didn't say anything, and she totally ignored him. She wasn't saying anything to him. And without looking at him, and in trying to point out why women will never be successful and are powerful so long as they're forced to take care of men, she said that if I were to have a baby today and it was a boy, I would throw him in the river. And at least some of the faces of the women in the room, I could see, was struck by how inappropriate that was. I don't think all, but some were. But nobody said anything about it. And Richie kind of got up, and he started to walk and started to go down the stairs to leave. And I ran after him, and I said, "Do you want to talk?" And he said, "No, I'll be okay. I just want to go be by myself." If I were older and wiser, I wouldn't have let him go. I would have just said, "No, we have to talk." And I don't think I ever saw him again. And I have no idea what happened to him.
That's really painful.
Yeah, it's painful to remember it because I think I should have done more, and I have no idea what happened to him. And whenever I hear the name Jill Johnson come up or see her book or anything, I have no respect for her, I have contempt for her. And of course, no one in that circle spoke up. But I could see that there were people who thought that they should have wanted to, but Jill Johnson was kind of an icon and an important issue, and this was her. Anyway.
So what were the dynamics between men and women generally in the GAA?
You know, I'm saying this through the filter of my being male. There were women who were highly respected. Nath Rockhill who was, you know, I think the first vice president of GA, was highly respected and beloved. And she was such a so sensible and compassionate and smart. I think she was a lawyer, but I'm not sure if I remember that right. Well, one of the issues that came up was the fact that we used the term gay. That was always, a problem that women wanted, felt that even though gay included women, it it made them invisible. That so, and in fact, one of the things that I remember, really important early GAA Firehouse Day story, in trying to get media attention. One of the campaigns projects that we had, we raised enough money to take a full page ad in the New York Times. And it was designed by pro bono by some big executive at an advertising agency. I'm sure somewhere I have a copy of it. It's likely in some archives anyway. But it was a full page ad, and it was a photograph of a man and a woman, a middle-aged man and a woman, husband and wife. They're both wearing black armbands, sitting at a table or a desk, and there's a photograph in a frame, but it's face down on the table. And they're both wearing black armbands. And the slogan, the only writing, the only copies was, "Your child's not dead, he's only gay." It was very effective. It was very, but when it was presented at the Firehouse, the women said, "But people aren't going to see lesbians in that." I think it was originally, "Your son's not dead, he's only gay." And so, as happens with committees, you do the right thing, but it makes it less. So when it finally was agreed on and was printed, it was, "Your child's not dead, only gay," which it just doesn't sound quite the same. But that was an example of something that happened between tensions between men and women, but because women were not happy with feeling that they're made invisible by the original version, it was changed, and what actually went in the newspaper was, "Your child's not dead, only gay," instead of "Your son's not dead, he's only gay."
That's interesting. And what about people of color? How much were they a part of the GAA?
Not a lot, but they were well incorporated and integrated into one of the interviews on this now DVD that I told you that I have from Firehouse Days is with a youth of color named Claude, who I actually saw last year. He lives on the West Coast now, but he was in New York. And Wayne Sunday. Do you know Wayne Sunday? He's still around. I think he's on the board of the Jim Owls Club. But he goes back to the Firehouse days, and he's in touch with a lot of those old people. And when I see him, he's always telling me about this one or that one, because he's in touch with people that I'm not. And so when Claude Wynn, when he was in town, Wayne Sunday insisted that we get together, and I actually showed him this old interview from the Firehouse days.
So I'm going to ask you one more question,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
and then we really are going to
Yeah.
back. So one of the things that I've heard from various points of view in the interviews I've been doing is about the coming together and the tension between the L, the G, the B, and the T. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are for this moment for all parts of the lesbian, gay, bi, and trans community to come together.
Okay. So Well, the National Gay Task Force was formed. It was the National Gay Task Force. Only the L was only added later. So there is this tension between how do you create more visibility, but how do you make it not a mouthful, or how do you make it, is the statement diluted by trying to be so inclusive? And it's a tough choice to make. So when people started adding, in among millennials, putting the Q on for queer, my first reaction was to bristle at that because, and I know many of my friends still do, older people, because we fought to get people to stop using the term queer. Queer was a derogatory, queer was fag, although some young people like to use fag now too. Getting people to stop using derogatory words was part of our early mission. So when people started to embrace that, it was very troublesome. But I got to a stage where I started to think, well, since queer is trying to connote the breaking down of boundaries and the non-binary, that maybe I would be comfortable. Can we just replace everything with queer and like take up the G and the L and the B and everything, just use Q and queer, just because it is more inclusive. So my personal thought is, I wish we had one word that meant everybody. It's similar to what happened with the rainbow flag. I think that, I'm sure you know that within the past year, some groups felt that they didn't see themselves in there because there was no black or brown. And I think that that's just a total misunderstanding of what the rainbow stands for. Like, I want to ask them, which color do you think I am? Or do you think that the yellow is for Asians? Is that what you're thinking? And trying to explain that the whole idea of the rainbow is the idea that it's physics. It's a spectrum. It's not. It's saying that beauty is made up of the entire range. And in fact, if you wanted to say that, when you asked me when we started out and you asked me to count and I threw 7.5 in there, it's because this has been in my mind recently that when you look at the 6 colors of the rainbow, they're not inclusive because you don't have turquoise, you don't have pink. There are all of these in between, called the 7.5s and the 2 3/4. But there's this understanding that these are the primary colors, represent the pureness at each stage, but it goes from blue to red because that's our visible spectrum of light. It includes everything without the halves and the 3/4. So I don't know if I'm answering or if I'm rambling, but in the world of political correctness, people get so bogged down in symbols and language that it makes real discourse so cumbersome that you can't really discuss things.
Do you think that in your experience, is there tension between, say, the trans community and the white gay community, or is that mean?
Well, if you're talking about the community, which community do you mean? Do you mean the bar community? Do you mean the party community, or do you mean the political community? In the political community, in the organized, LGBT community at the center, or at Hedrick Martin, or at Ali Forney Center, or even at Eshel, or at the Wider Bridge, or the Brooklyn Center, or HRC. At any of these organized political programs, I don't think those tensions exist. I think they're brought up. I think they're discussed, but I think there's there's a tangible, strong effort to listen and to break down those boundaries and to be inclusive. But what happens, in that part of the community that's, just the social community, of course that exists. I just read something just this week that at the Monster Bar on Christopher Street there was some allegation of racism, and one of the performers, a drag artist, Honey Davenport, that walked out because of the way she felt that people of color were disrespected in the bar. So, so yeah, that certainly exists.
But you also feel like there's a serious effort to cross lines and
I know it. I mean, I hear it. I know that it's a struggle and a awareness that on boards and on committees, people do look around and say, everybody's not represented here. There are not enough women. There are not enough trans people. There are no people of color, and so we all get involved in that painful process of how do you try to create more inclusiveness and not get into tokenism, and it's not easy. Not easy. There are multiple reasons why why more people of color are not on board, and it's not necessarily a result of them being excluded, but maybe feeling excluded. It might be a result of their not feeling motivated to join in the first place or to apply. So, how do you bring in those voices without bringing in the wrong ones, or or as I said, the tokenism of just the first person who walks in the door, you say, do you want to be on the board? And that does happen.
Is there anything you want to say before we sign off for real this time?
No, because then we're going to open a can of worms and not shut up. So
All right.
we're good.
Thank you.
Okay.